October 29th, 1929. One single morning. And by the time the sun went down, everything was gone. Not slowly, not gradually. Gone. Like someone reached into the chest of an entire nation and just ripped it out. I've spent years trying to understand how that happens. How a country that powerful, that confident, that proud just collapses. And the more I dug into it, the more I realized something that genuinely shook me. The story we were all told about what fixed it is wrong. And I don't mean slightly off. I mean completely, dangerously wrong. And the mistake we made back then, we're still making it today. Let me take you back. Black Tuesday, October 29th, 1929. The stock market didn't just dip. It didn't just correct. It fell off a cliff. 12% in a single day. Fortunes that took generations to build. Gone before lunch. Banks that had stood for decades. Shuttered by dinner. Businesses that employed entire neighborhoods. Locked up by the weekend. And it didn't stop there. By 1933, 1 in 4 Americans had no job. 25%. Think about what that actually means. Walk down any street in America, and every 4th person you pass, unemployed. Not between jobs, not looking. Desperate. Bread lines stretched for blocks. Men who had owned homes, worn suits, provided for their families, standing in the cold, waiting for a bowl of soup. Families who had lived in houses were now building shelters out of cardboard and scrap metal in makeshift camps they called Hoovervilles, named after the president they blamed. A father named Jeff is standing outside one of those camps. His kid looks up at him and asks what's going to happen. And Jeff says the only thing a father can say when he has no answer. He says, "We'll figure it out. We always do." They didn't figure it out. Not for a long time. His kids grew up with a definition of full that meant not hungry enough to cry. That was the bar. That was what survival looked like in the wealth. So Franklin Roosevelt stepped in, and he came in swinging. Public works programs, relief agencies, the New Deal. Government on a scale America had never seen. They built bridges, dams, highways, entire infrastructure systems that still exist today. And yes, it helped. Real people got paychecks. Real families ate. But here's what the history books quietly skip over. 10 years after Black Tuesday, 1939, unemployment in America was still sitting at 15%. A decade later, after all those programs, all that spending, all that government intervention, still 15%. And then something happened that had nothing to do with economics. We interrupt this broadcast. The Japanese have attacked Pearl Harbor. The United States is at war. Overnight, everything flipped. Factories that had been sitting dark and quiet for years suddenly roared back to life. Except now they weren't making refrigerators and furniture. They were making tanks, bombers, ammunition. Ford's assembly lines, which had been half dead, started rolling out military aircraft around the clock. Defense spending exploded from 1.4% of the economy all the way to over 37%. 17 million new jobs appeared. Unemployment crashed below 2%. Jeff got called to a tank plant in Cleveland. First steady paycheck in years. His family finally exhaled. An economist looked at all of this and said, See what happens when government spends? World War II proved it. Case closed. But hold on. Let me show you what was actually happening inside those numbers. It's 1944. Jeff's family is sitting around the kitchen table. His wife is going through the ration booklets, trying to figure out how to feed 4 kids on 2 pounds of meat for the entire week. They're out of sugar coupons until next month.
Gasoline is rationed. Coffee is rationed. Shoes are rationed. You could not buy a new car. Production had been completely banned since 1942. And yet, the newspaper on that same kitchen table is telling them they've never been more prosperous. Jeff's wife looks at that headline and says, "Great, I'll tell the kids to eat the newspaper." This is the part that breaks the whole myth wide open. Yes, GDP was exploding. The numbers looked incredible on paper, but Americans were living under some of the strictest government control of daily life in U.S. history. You couldn't buy what you wanted. You couldn't spend freely. Americans were saving over 25% of their income, not because they had suddenly become financially wise, but because there was almost nothing legal to buy. Here's the uncomfortable truth about GDP. It counts everything the same. If a family builds a house, that adds to GDP. If the government builds a bomb and drops it into the ocean, that also adds to GDP. Same number. Completely different outcome for actual human beings. The wartime boom was a statistical illusion. Jeff was earning more than he ever had and eating less than when he was broke. So here's the real test, the moment that should have settled this debate permanently. 1945, the war ends. 10 million soldiers are coming home. Government spending is about to drop by over 60%. Every major economist at the time looked at those numbers and said the same thing. We are looking at the greatest unemployment crisis any economy has ever faced. Paul Samuelson, future Nobel Prize winner, wrote it down. Predicted an epidemic of economic violence. President Truman himself said mass unemployment was obvious and coming. They were all completely, totally wrong. Bomb factories became appliance factories. Car plants switched from building tanks back to building Chevrolets. Shipyards that had been making destroyers started building fishing boats. Over 20 million people were released from war-related work, and unemployment peaked at just 3.9%. Truman himself later called it the swiftest and most gigantic economic changeover any nation had ever made. The economy didn't survive the spending cuts. It thrived because of them. Resources that had been locked inside the war machine flowed back into making things people actually wanted to buy. The prediction failed completely, in real time, with the whole world watching. But nobody updated the textbooks. And if the war didn't fix the Great Depression, what actually did? To answer that, you have to go back even further, back to 1914, World War I. Countries mobilizing millions of soldiers, building artillery, battleships, uniforms, supplies, all of it simultaneously on a scale the world had never seen. All of it requiring money. Enormous, staggering, almost incomprehensible amounts of money. Normally, governments fund things through taxes, but you can't squeeze enough out of citizens when half of them are already in the trenches. So the money runs out, the treasury runs dry, and the war isn't over. So what do? You print it. Except there was a problem. Back then, most of the world ran on the gold standard. Every dollar, every pound, every franc had to be backed by actual physical gold sitting in a vault. You couldn't just print endlessly. So one by one, governments made a decision. They abandoned the gold standard. And then they started printing. And then the war ended, but the printing didn't. France devalued. Britain devalued to undercut France. Germany went so far off the rails that a single loaf of bread eventually cost 200 billion marks. A woman in Berlin needed a wheelbarrow full of cash just to buy groceries. A race to the bottom. Every country destroying its own money, trying to steal trade from its neighbors. And in the end, nobody gained anything. World trade collapsed by 66% between 1929 and 1934. Trust in money itself collapsed. And when people lose trust in money,
They lose trust in everything. They get scared. They get angry. They start looking for someone to blame. They start listening to anyone standing on a stage promising to fix it all. Germany chose Hitler. Italy chose Mussolini. Japan chose military expansion. The path from a printing press to a battlefield was shorter than anyone imagined. So in 1944, delegates from 44 nations gathered at a massive hotel in the mountains of New Hampshire, and they sat down to figure out how to make sure this never happened again. What they came up with was called the Bretton Woods system, and honestly, it was almost offensively simple. Every major currency gets pegged to the US dollar, and the US dollar gets pegged to gold, $35 per ounce, fixed. That was the anchor. If you got too wild with the printing press, the peg would break, and markets would punish you immediately. There was a hard limit, a ceiling, a stop sign. And for the first time in decades, money actually meant something again. Take Friedrich in post-war Germany. His city is rubble. His father's machine shop is half destroyed. But the money in his pocket is now tied to something real, something stable, something he can actually plan around. So he takes out a loan, rebuilds, hires people, expands. Multiply Friedrich by millions of people across Europe and Japan. That's why they boomed. Countries that had just been flattened, literally flattened, came roaring back. Not because of massive spending programs, because underneath everything was one boring but absolutely essential foundation. Stable money. Money with an anchor. Money that politicians couldn't casually print away whenever they needed to cover a bad decision. That was the real cure. But the system had one fatal flaw that nobody wanted to talk about. Bretton Woods told every country on Earth, tie your currency to the dollar. Trust the dollar. But it never answered one critical question. Who watches America? If France printed too many francs, the peg broke and markets crushed them. If Japan got reckless with the yen, they'd pay for it immediately. But the United States was the peg. America could spend money it didn't have and quietly force the rest of the world to absorb the cost. For a while, America behaved itself. Then came the 1960s. Vietnam, Lyndon Johnson's Great Society, a war overseas, and a massive welfare expansion at home simultaneously. Someone in the room asked the obvious question, can we actually afford both? Johnson essentially said, we'll do it anyway. So America flooded the world with dollars, more and more dollars. But the gold sitting in Fort Knox stayed exactly the same, which meant the promise behind every dollar was quietly becoming worth less and less. And one man noticed, Charles de Gaulle, president of France. He did the math. He realized that if every country tried to cash in their dollars for gold at the same time, America would run out completely. So he decided France would not be the last one standing in line. In 1965, he sent ships and planes to the United States and said, we would like our gold back. Please. He was blunt about it publicly. He said America was printing dollars without backing and forcing the rest of the world to hold paper that was slowly losing its value. He called it robbery with better tailoring. Other countries started getting the same idea. By 1966, the United States had $3.2 billion in gold to cover $14 billion in foreign dollar claims. The math didn't work. Everyone could see it. In 1971, West Germany walked away from Bretton Woods entirely. Then Britain requested $3 billion in gold. It was a full bank run, except the bank was the United States of America. So on August 13th, 1971, Richard Nixon gathered his closest advisors at Camp David. No press, no Congress, just a room full of men staring at impossible numbers. 2 days later, Nixon interrupted Sunday night television across America. He said, effective immediately,
the United States will suspend the convertibility of the dollar into gold. He called it a temporary measure. The anchor was gone. Every currency in the world was now backed by nothing except a government's promise not to print too much. So how did that promise hold up? Gold had been fixed at $35 under Bretton Woods. By 2026, it hit over $5,000. Within 2 years of Nixon's announcement, the oil crisis hit.
Inflation surged. Growth stalled. Economists were so confused by the combination that they had to invent an entirely new word, stagflation, because nothing in their models explained how you could have both rising prices and a shrinking economy at the same time. Then came the crises. 1974, 1979, the savings and loan collapse, the dot-com bust, 2008. Every decade, a new disaster. And every single time, the solution was the same. Print more. And every time someone raised their hand and asked whether this was actually sustainable, someone would pull out the same talking point. World War II proved that government spending fixes the economy. No, it didn't. But the myth survived because it was useful. If people believe that, then deficits sound responsible. Printing sounds necessary. And every crisis becomes a justification for doing more of the exact thing that made the system fragile in the first place. There's a quote that's been rattling around in my head since I started digging into all of this. It was written by John Maynard Keynes himself, the man whose ideas became the foundation of modern economic policy. He said, "There is no subtler, no surer means of overturning the existing basis of society than to debauch the currency." He understood it. He wrote it down. And then the world built an entire global financial system on the opposite assumption. Here's what I want you to actually take away from this. The Great Depression wasn't fixed by spending. It wasn't fixed by war. It was fixed, temporarily, by stable money, by an anchor, by a system that forced discipline on governments that had none. And the moment that anchor was removed, we didn't go back to the chaos of the 1930s overnight. It happened slowly, crisis by crisis, decade by decade, each one a little worse, each solution kicking the problem further down the road. We are living in the long aftermath of that August night in 1971. Every price that feels too high, every debt that feels impossible, every economic anxiety you carry, it has roots that go back to a room at Camp David and a decision that was supposed to be temporary. The scariest part isn't what happened back then. The scariest part is that we're still pretending the anchor isn't gone.